After Yogananda's guru passes, he comes back to him when Yogananda's in a hotel room in India and appears to him in the flesh, or seemingly in the flesh, and describes to him the astral realms that he now resides in great detail about all the beings and the non-physical realities and the souls who inhabit different lokas, different locations, places in the astral realm, and the joys of it. This occurs during the 1 year Yogananda spent in India.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Channel Within. Today's conversation is one that I've been looking forward to. I am excited to be speaking with Philip Goldberg, who has written The Life of Yogananda, which explores the life of Paramahansa Yogananda in a more expansive and historical way. Many of us have been deeply touched by the autobiography of a yogi, a book that introduced us to the idea that we are more than the body, consciousness lives on, and there is something eternal within us. But like many spiritual texts, it offers a window. And I'm hoping to learn more about Yogananda from Philip today. Thank you, Philip, and welcome. Thank you for being here with me today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Awesome. So, what made you decide to look into maybe expanding Yogananda's, uh, giving us more of a window into his life on a personal level?
In 2010, I published a book called American Veda, which told the whole history of how India's spiritual treasures came to the US and became part of American culture and spirituality going back a couple of hundred years. And in that context, several of the spiritual teachers who came here from India, there were many, of course, over the course of years, but a few had a major impact. Yogananda was one of those few. And so I devoted a whole chapter to him in American Veda, as I did to a couple of others. And I became fascinated not just with his contribution, which was huge, but his life story, because with with gurus and swamis and people who are renunciates, as he was, we don't usually know much about their personal lives, but he wrote Autobiography of a Yogi famously, and so much was known about his life, and it was a fascinating life. But in American Veda, I only had one chapter to devote to it, and I felt, boy, I had to leave out so much, which was true of other people as well. But after the book was published, and I was thinking, what do I want to do next? The thought of doing a biography of one of the major teachers occurred to me, and he was the likely choice because he had such a fascinating personal life. Well, at least as far as we know, because the others didn't say much about their lives. And my first thought was, how do you write a biography, or why write a biography of somebody who's known throughout the world for his own autobiography, which I'd read more than, a few times. And so I went back to it and looked closely and realized he left out a lot. He left out big chunks of his life or just went into certain things in a sort of glossed over that I thought would make a good story if I could find the details. And so I set out to fill in the gaps of a very important life and a very interesting life that were not well known. And so that required a good deal of research. But that was my main motivation, to flesh out his life and to humanize him and to convey to readers things about his life that he, for one reason or another, left out.
That's a really good point because when I read it for the first time, I remember thinking, well, this wasn't really an autobiography, it's a more of a spiritual classic. And then I realized he didn't talk much about himself in there at all.
That's right. Well, he did, but the book, it's called an autobiography, and but if it, it's also other things. You could get four different books. You could get just a brief autobiography of overview of his personal life. You could have a synopsis of all of Indian philosophy. You could have stories about other people. Much of Autobiography of a Yogi is about these fascinating gurus and swamis and people he met, people of great stature like Ramana Maharshi and Anandamoy Ma, people of in science, people of, other in other fields of endeavor, and all these yogis and interesting people he tells stories about. So there's a lot in that book that's not about his life. And that's, I think, one of the reasons the book is so popular even now, so many decades after he wrote it. Um, but there were things to be said about his life that I think are very worth knowing and learning from.
Absolutely. Before we talk about the cities that you alluded to, what aspects of his life surprised you the most when conducting your research?
He had more challenges and more difficulties in fulfilling his mission and adapting to life in America than you would appreciate from just his autobiography. Um, it was not easy to do what he did. And we like to think that uh, people of great spiritual stature, people of elevated states of consciousness, um, have a smooth sailing in life. But when you realize how difficult it was to represent his lineage and the whole spiritual heritage of India in 1920s America, and with all the racism and prejudice and ignorance that he had to face, and then go through the Great Depression and the war years, um, and the difficulties of making ends meet, and the challenges of having people who would be in opposition to what he was trying to accomplish for a variety of reasons, um, and just the difficulties of getting anything done on a, as a, to build a spiritual organization as a monk in a foreign culture. I mean, it was a great challenge. So that I thought it was makes logical sense that it would be challenging and difficult. But when I did the research, I came upon things that were little known, and I was surprised by lawsuits, accusations, opposition, threats, all kinds of things that made it a challenge.
Do you think he omitted those parts of his life to preserve a certain spiritual message in his autobiography?
Um, I don't pretend to be able to understand anybody's motives, let alone somebody with of his stature and with his awareness and his unique mission. So I can't speak to why he left out certain things, but I know as an author, you have to make choices. And, so he chose to devote pages to things he wanted to convey and probably didn't think it was as in some instances, he probably didn't think it would be interesting to people. For example, his first 4 or so years in America were in Boston. He didn't know anybody. He just was starting out. He wasn't even sure he'd stay. But those 4 years were fascinating and set him on the stage for doing what he eventually accomplished. But in his autobiography, he writes off those 4 years in a sentence or two. And I thought, well, what was it like? How did he come to even stay for 4 years? How did he feed himself? Where did he live? How did he deal with winter in New England? He's a child of Bengal, where it's 70 degrees in the winter. What, how did he deal with it? How did he meet people? What happened? And so that required some research. He did talk and write about those things, but not in his autobiography. But I was given certain access to written materials and so forth that filled in the gaps. And people around him had written about him and written about what it was like in those days. So when you put it all together, it's a fascinating story. So that's one thing. He may have just thought it wouldn't be of much interest, or not as much interest as writing about the yogis and the siddhas that he wrote about. About the other things, like difficulties with people challenging his work, people making accusations, people filing lawsuits. There were things he probably felt were best left unsaid for whatever reason. I can't guess as to what his reasoning was, but he elected not to talk about certain things.
One thing I got from reading his book is his earnesty in devoting his life to
Yeah.
God and having access to his personal letters. I'm curious, his writing, with Hindi or being his native language, his writing is so good. Sometimes I had to look up words. And my ancestors are from India. Was his personal letters like that too? And I think I'm a really good English speaker.
In some, now we're getting into very interesting territory
Mhm.
because, well, certainly, obviously, English was not his first language. He was Bengali. So he knew Bengali and he knew Hindi.
Mhm.
Um, I don't think there were any of the other Indian languages would have he have been fluent in. But at the same time, he was raised educated in British schools. So, everybody of educated classes in India at that time would know English. He was actually insecure about his English when he set out to, he was concerned, would his English hold up in America? And his guru reassured him that it would, and of course it did. He knew English much better than he realized. But there's a difference between giving a talk and writing a book. And he had written many essays and, all that in the course of his time here. But he had a particular style. And so if you're writing a letter to somebody, it's informal. You're not, you're more likely to express emotion in a letter. You're less likely to worry about the nuances of language. So there's a difference, as it would be with most people. If you looked at my emails, it's very different from the style of writing a book. So there would be a difference. But his writing style, some people love it, and some people do not, because it's very flowery. It's it's very elaborate, and I remember he's very fond of using unusual words or big words, fancy words, and flowery language, um, various nuances and twists of syntax and all that. A few things to know about that. One, um, even in the 1940s and 50s, when it was first published, it came out in 1946. But even when we were reading it, people like me in the 1960s and 70s, um, it seemed old-fashioned in its writing style, almost Victorian. And it was charming in a certain way, but also not so charming in other is a little unusual. And so people have mixed reactions to it. So, but there's a few things to consider. One, he had editors. He had help. A lot of his writing was um, verbal. He would speak verbally, and he had people taking meticulous notes and shorthand, and then they would transcribe it, and then they would type it up, and then he would read it, and he would make changes and edit it. It was a big process. He had a staff of editors, and so that's one thing. How much influence did they have, and all that. But the other thing is, I once mentioned his writing style to an Indian scholar who said it's very Bengali.
Mm.
And I don't understand that. I didn't know that. But every language in India and all the subcultures on the Indian subcontinent, they have literary styles and histories and cultures of their own. And it turns out that the Bengali style at that time, anyway, was known for being elaborate and all that. And if you look at the works of Rabindranath Tagore and other Bengalis, you see that. They're much more polished and professional. So it all that factors in, and some people, and that gives the book its own unique charm because you're getting it. It's the style. It's a unique style. Not every writer of English prose in the 1940s sounded like that. You have to, and especially if you were a student of literature, because that was the time when Ernest Hemingway and all those people, that very, very different style of writing than Autobiography of a Yogi. So, but
Yeah, absolutely. I loved it. And I studied English and finance as a double major. And I used to have to be accompanied by a dictionary when I was reading his works. But can you talk about this, that he's and the Tiger Swami, the levitation, the being in two places at one time that he talked about.
The miracles,
The miracles, yes.
the superpowers. Now that element of the autobiography always stands out. And I joke, but it's not entirely a joke, that there's two kinds of people who are fans of Autobiography of a Yogi. One, love the miracles, can't get enough of them. It's one of the reasons they love the book. The other type of person doesn't believe in that they're true at all, or is very skeptical about it, wonders why he devotes so much space to it, and loves the book anyway for all the other reasons. And so, the miracle part of it is it stands out. Turns out that his original idea was to write a book that was going to be called The Yogi Christs of India, about all the great yogis and what they can accomplish with their minds, with their consciousness, all the stories of what we think of as miracles and the powers called siddhis, um, and what consciousness uh, is inherently capable of. So he wanted to write a book like that, and that was part of his plan at a certain period after the war when well, no, actually before World War II, when he decided to spend less time traveling and more uh, creating a written legacy and writing books that he always wanted to write. But he was also had the idea of doing his life story, and people were encouraging him to do that. So essentially, Autobiography of a Yogi is those two books combined. He had a lot of material, and he combined those things, his life story and the story of the miracles and all that. So the question then becomes, why devote so much time to those stories? It obviously attracts attention. So if you are an editor and you are out to sell books, you say, yeah, give me those juicy stories. People want to hear about that. It'll be, controversial and interesting. But I don't think that was his motivation. Um, I think, for one thing, he and other gurus, there's a kind of paradox in Indian spiritual tradition where the powers of the mind, the powers of consciousness, the capabilities of human consciousness can be can be extraordinary. And there are examples of it throughout Indian history of people with these attainments. And they demonstrate they're sort of evidence for what the mind is capable of, what potential the human consciousness has. At the same time, so they're used for that purpose and told for that purpose. At the same time, every responsible spiritual teacher, including Yogananda, including Buddha, including all the Patanjali and all the great uh, legends of Indian history, they'll acknowledge the possibility and the existence and the validity of these powers, and at the same time discourage people from getting too caught up in them. They'll say, don't be distracted. The main goal is moksha. The main goal is spiritual liberation. The main goal is union with the divine. The main goal is to unite your consciousness with the consciousness of the cosmos, and to be awakened and self-realized and so forth. Don't be distracted by these things. They're just baubles. They might come spontaneously as a person grows spiritually, or they may not, but being aware of them is useful. Getting obsessed by them and too caught up in them is self is a destructive thing, a distraction from the true path. So that paradox exists, and you see it in Autobiography of a Yogi itself and in all of his teachings. And it's echoed in the Yoga Sutras and all that. And so why then include them? When I was researching the book, I asked one of his disciples, one of the main disciples in Self-Realization Fellowship, who was an important source to me. At one point, I said, "Why do you think he spent so much time, space in the autobiography on the powers?" And my source opened the book to what's called the title page
Mm-hmm.
in publishing, where it gives you the title and the author and the publisher. And in it, and I had looked at this, I've had this book for many decades. You don't read that page, you just go to where the substance begins. But right there on the title page, it says, "Except ye see signs and wonders, ye will not believe." That's from the New Testament. And when he showed that to me, I laughed and I said, "Oh, I get it." People need that kind of thing to open their minds. Many people do anyway. The philosophy, the descriptions of self-realization, that can be abstract. But when you see somebody who appears to be in two places at once, or who can levitate, or who knows what's going on at a distance, all those kinds of things, it opens your eyes, it gets your attention. And so I think that was one of his motivations for writing about it.
Yeah, thank you. Since you mentioned the Yogi Christ in India, one thing that really I really loved about his work is the assimilation of Christ. And when I saw this book when I was really young, I was like, I would never read an autobiography by someone in an orange garb.
Were
I'm not
you still
interested.
in India at that time?
No, so my grandparents went to Trinidad and I came to the US when I was 16. I may have seen it in New York, and I was thinking I would never read a book like that because he's an intermediary between me and God, God and myself. However, I kept seeing the book, and then I learned that Steve Jobs, it was his only book in on his iPad, and he happened to actually give it to all 500 guests at his 2011 memorial service. And
Well,
then,
he didn't give it.
right, exactly. That's right. So I realized that I'm getting this book keeps coming up and I need to read it. I read it and and I was so humbled with such an appreciation for him because I saw his reluctance to come to America as well
Yeah,
when he went back to India, didn't want to come back, but he was fulfilling his mission. And I love that. Was it in the book or somewhere else that I heard about Christ actually being in his lineage,
yeah.
lineage?
Now, um, every guru in India, every Swami, every Sampradaya, all the different lineages, you will always see Jesus revered and respected. It's one of the hallmarks of the traditions that were born in India, when we think of as Hinduism and Buddhism, that high regard for the saints and spiritual figures of every tradition are highly respected and revered. And so, despite the the horrors of the British imperial enterprise in India and the attempt the coerced conversions and all the things that were, unfortunate things that were done in the name of Christ and Christianity. Nevertheless, most Indian people and certainly all the spiritual figures can separate those things from the figure of Jesus himself. And so he's, depending on who you speak to, is either considered a great yogi, a great master, spiritual master, or even an incarnation in the same breath as Krishna and Rama and Buddha and all the others. So he's in the pantheon of great spiritual teachers. Yogananda was the same, but he took it to another level by, first of all, speaking and writing about Christ far more than any of the other teachers I'm familiar with. Um, and people will will ask, why did he go to such lengths to do that? Why was Christmas and Easter celebrated in his self-realization fellowship to a level that most Christians don't even celebrate it? And above all, why did he consider Jesus part of his lineage? If you go to any of the centers that represent Yogananda's lineage, you'll see on the altar an image of Krishna and an image of Jesus, along with Yogananda and his guru's guru, and Babaji, his guru's guru's guru. So that's the lineage, and Jesus is there. So he contends that uh, Jesus and Krishna, in their universal disembodied forms, uh, or Yogananda and Babaji, were sort of in communication and in sync about the mission of his lineage and Kriya Yoga. And his interpretation, of course, of who Jesus was and what Jesus said, and the whole story is not one you would hear in churches in America or Europe, but it has its own flavor. And for many people who were raised Christian and turned away from the church, or people who were raised Jewish, as many of his followers were, um, it was reading Autobiography of a Yogi that made them change their minds. Now they could view that whole history and that whole story of Jesus and his teachings in a different way, that in a way that was more acceptable to them. I'm one of those people, essentially. I had no religious upbringing, and I thought all this Christ stuff was nonsense. I'd never even read a Bible. I read Autobiography of a Yogi, and I said, oh, maybe I'm missing something. So I then read the New Testament for the first time, and I said, oh, this is not what I grew up hearing about, and Christmas carols and everything. He was a great yogi. He was a great master, a Sadguru. And so that's a long answer to your question, but yes, Yogananda went even further in revering and venerating Jesus by also making him part of the teachings that he was conveying and part of and claiming him as part of his lineage. To that,
No,
people
thank
will always say, since I wrote my book, do you think Yogananda did that because he was pandering to an American audience of Christians? And I thought, no, I think he was sincere. I think he really meant it. He may have done things like have Sunday morning services and, give talks about Jesus and everything because of his audience. But that's just what good teachers do. You address the interests and the concerns of your audience. But I don't think he was faking it by any means. He wasn't making it up. I think he really meant it.
Yeah, I would agree with that because as a second generation Indian, uh, Christ is, like you said, included in all Hindu places of worship and among the avatars who came on earth. Um, would you go as far as saying that he did allude to Christ in the lost years being with his lineage?
Um, I can't remember actually, to be honest, whether he addressed that. But there are people who truly believe that in the undocumented years of Christ's life, basically from early childhood to age 30-ish, um, he spent time in India. And that's not unreasonable. There was traffic going between parts of India and what we think of as the Holy Land, the Middle East, long before the time of Christ. There were Jewish settlements in Kerala that
That's right.
the trading, there's a synagogue in Kochi because traders were coming from the Middle East and some settled there. And, Alexander the Great, got to India and back. And so, there was connection between uh, what we think of as the early Western civilizations and India. So it's not inconceivable. Or that, some yogis got to the Middle East and, helped educate young Jesus. But we don't know for sure, of course. And I leave that kind of speculation to other people. But there are people who are convinced that it's true. So,
Yeah, so before we leave the speculation, I had one thought on that because, I grew up hearing that he was in India, like you said. And then I used to think that, he was being taught by these yogis. And then one day I was thinking, if he is the son of God or an avatar in some capacity, maybe he was teaching them instead.
or both.
Or both,
Maybe there was
exactly.
a cultural exchange.
Yes.
But if he was young,
Hmm.
if he was a teenager, and he had this cosmic mission to teach, he had to be educated. So if among his mentors were learned rabbis, and maybe there's a lot of talk about the influence of Persia at that time, maybe some of the Persian mystics, the Zoroastrians, but why not yogis? Maybe they also had an influence on him. We don't know.
Yeah, sure. Can you talk a little bit about the Maya and this cosmic magician and how he addressed it?
This is an interesting thing because among the many paradoxes you find in the spiritual circles, especially if you see how the Eastern traditions were translated into, Western languages and Western culture. The word Maya, of course, comes up a lot, the term, and Yogananda used it a lot. And in some instances, and you'll see it here in the autobiography, he goes into it with great sophistication and detail. But in everyday speech, it would often be just a kind of shorthand for the material world and its illusions. So one of the ways Maya is translated as illusion. And so people will use it to say, oh, don't take the world seriously. It's all just illusions. It's all just changing images by analogy on the movie screen. Don't get caught up in them. Don't become obsessed with them. Don't make the mistake of thinking that's all there is, that's all of reality. Those are just flickering, temporary phenomena. Turn your attention to the light that makes those visions possible. That's a metaphor, not unlike the famous metaphor that Plato used of the shadows in the cave. But Yogananda sometimes sounds like that. Don't get caught up in this world. Put your attention on your spiritual practice and becoming, your inner divinity and your oneness with God. Uh, at the same time, he worked very hard and he wanted the people around him to perform their duties and responsibilities with skill and effort and dedication and to behave themselves in the world properly. So it sounds like a paradox. Don't get caught up in this world. It's all illusion. It's all it lacks the reality of the infinite and the eternal. At the same time, you may be just an actor on the stage, but play your role well. Play it to perfectly. And he could be tough on people as his guru was tough on him to behave in the world responsibly, even though all the events and phenomena of the world are just fleeting images and phenomena. That's one of the paradoxes. And the way I've come to understand it is saying the world is just an illusion is to dismiss the reality of life in the world and its ability to give us joy and suffering. We're in the world to transcend the world, but we're still in the world as human beings and we have to play our role. So, one way to understand illusion is to say it doesn't exist. It's like a mirage. Somebody in the desert sees what they think is water, and it turns out to be a mirage. It's not real. There is no water. That's one way to understand illusion, Maya. This is all unreal. At the same time, it is real. So maybe there's another way to understand it. And the other way to understand illusion is the kind that magicians use. They create illusions. They make you think something is there when it's not. The rabbit is not in the hat. The woman is not being sawed in half. They're creating an illusion. That's what Maya does. It creates the illusion that something is all there is, but there's more going on. So when you really look at what Yogananda was saying, he was saying, don't get caught up in Maya, meaning don't succumb to the illusion that the world of the senses, and all these phenomena are all there is. No, there's an invisible divine reality that is more real than these changing circumstances. And that's what we need to open our awareness to, not to just dismiss the world as, just the realm of foolishness and ignore the reality. He cared about life in the world. He had a mission to accomplish. He wanted the world to be a better place. He spoke out against injustices. He was a, a advocate of India's independence movement. And so life in the world may have been an illusion, but it was one to take seriously at the same time.
I really like that clarification. One chapter that I go back to whenever I need comforting is chapter 43, which really shows his humanity when Yukteswar comes back to visit him. And can you speak a little bit about that?
That's a really interesting chapter.
I love
Uh,
it. I love it so much.
but and other people don't, Mira. It's a controversial one.
It's
Um,
polarizing.
hmm?
Is it polarizing then?
I don't know if it's polarizing, but
Controversial.
some people will think, "Oh, he's made all that up. That didn't really happen." And how does he know? And, people can be skeptical as they are about the superpowers and all that. But for your listeners, the chapter that we're talking about is after Yogananda's guru passes, he comes back to him when Yogananda's in a hotel room in India and appears to him in the flesh, or seemingly in the flesh, and describes to him the astral realms that he now resides in great detail, about all the beings and the non-physical realities and the souls who inhabit different lokas, different locations, places in the astral realm, and the joys of it. This occurs during the 1 year Yogananda spent in India, halfway through his time in America. And it was the only time he got to his homeland uh, between his coming to America in 1920 and his death in 1952. And he had the opportunity to see his beloved guru one more time, and then the guru passed away. And in his grief, Yogananda, um, this experience occurs. And to some people, it's the most exquisite chapter in the book because, in the context of reincarnation, the understanding of multiple lives on Earth, the question, what happens between lives? And what do people who don't come back? What, what, what do their souls experience? This is a defining chapter for many people in that regard because it goes into great detail about those realms. And we should say there's other schools of thought in India that have their own version of these realms. But that's that chapter 43. And so I guess many people find it. Let me ask you, Mira, why do you single it out? What is it of great comfort to you to?
Yeah, it's very comforting and it resonated so deeply with me. I lost my mom last year and
Mm,
I've gone back to it. It's by my bedside and I keep rereading it. And I feel like it helps to give me a good explanation of what happens. And, I've talked to some near death experiences as well. And I feel like based on our energy, that's the locus that we will gravitate towards. And I just love the humanity. Remember, I went in reading this book with a level of arrogance. So
Hmm.
that really helped me to see Yogananda in a different way as well as the message that Sri Yukteswar brought back that we live on and, that our loved ones lives on. I also was initially I was a seeker, and I wanted my interest in God was the intellectual side. And so hearing that he was teaching people, um, just made me want crave
Yeah,
more for and just love them both more.
that's good. That's beautiful. And one of the other things that made Yogananda's life of interest to me to write more about and discover, to flesh out details in. Um, we like to think of spiritual masters like Yogananda as being above and beyond human, uh, f frailties and emotions. But he was very open, about his times of grief and unhappiness and disappointment. Um, One of the moving things about his life was, his mother died when he was very young. He was 11 or 12 years old, and it was had a huge impact on him. And he wrote about that.
That
And
poem, have you read that poem? The
oh
Cosmic,
yeah,
Cos Beautiful.
yes, of course. And the effect it had on him of turning him toward the feminine aspect of God, which was an important part of his life. Um, but also, one of the things I wanted to bring out that he was candid about certain human things in his autobiography, but as I said, he left out a lot. And there were times when he was very upset when life in America was just too difficult and his, opposition was too annoying and running an organization. I mean, he was essentially a CEO running an organization of, with employees and volunteers who were also disciples of his, which makes it more complicated. And things didn't always go well or easily, and there were money difficulties, especially during the Great Depression. And there were times when he wanted to leave, and he just longed to go back to India and live the simple life of a monk, which is what he thought he was aiming for before he, accepted this mission to go to America. But he never did turn his back on the mission. He was open about the conflict he felt and the desire he felt to be rid of all this responsibility. But he stayed true to the mission. And there's a lesson in there for all of us. If someone like Yogananda can go through difficulties in life, what about the rest of us ordinary people? We too have to deal with challenges in life. And maybe in his example, we could do it with a little more grace and a little more dignity. So that's that human quality, which is exhibited, in his grief for the loss of his beloved guru, even though he knows there's no, death is not what we think it is, and the soul lives on, and the presence of the guru is in his heart. Even though you know all that, he was still human enough to be in grief. And I think that's something for all of us to learn from.
Yeah, it really. showed his humanity, and you can have a great understanding of death like he did and still go through that grieving process, and the reunion was just beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, Philip, after spending so much time immersed in his life, has your own understanding of life and death shifted in any meaningful way? And you just told us about living life in a graceful manner. So just to expand on that a little bit.
Um, Writing about Yogananda's life in that book was just one of, chapter in more than 50 years of exploring Indian spiritual teachings and writing about them and integrating them into my life and into my work. So it's hard to single out whether studying his life and writings changed my views. They they were more on an emotional level, they were very moving. And what I said before was the bigger takeaway for me was, yeah, who am I to complain if I have, to deal with life in the world? And who am I to use as an excuse for ignoring responsibility, the fact that it's all Maya and all illusion? Yogananda didn't, and he was one of the people who taught me this. So that was my big takeaway. I yes, I learned from that chapter one vision of what uh, the non-physical reality souls inhabit might be. But I'd read that 50 years ago. So rereading it and writing about it in my biography of Yogananda didn't change my views really. Um, so my big takeaways were more, how do we live with these teachings in the real world? And in that regard, I see Yogananda's life story as lessons for all of us. And you find some of it in his autobiography, and you'll find more of it in my biography of his, because that's what I focused on, the human story.
His death was a spiritual mystery as well. Can you talk about that?
There are several really interesting things about his passing. For one, he was 59 years old. That's relatively young, especially when you think about some of the people he writes about, some of the great yoga masters who lived a lot longer than that. And so you wonder about the wear and tear on his body because he was in the world in a big American city doing, working very hard. So that's one factor. I have to say that in writing about the time leading up to his death and the day of his death, it was the most moving part of writing his life story for me, because he knew he wasn't going to live long. He had that sense that he was not his time was limited. The last few years of his life, they were physical, there were illnesses and uh, pain and stuff that he had to deal with, and he was determined to leave, to protect his legacy, to make sure his all of his efforts would endure. And that meant training people to take over after he passed, and creating an institutional framework for the teachings to continue, and to make sure that his organization was well funded. And he worked very hard at that. He worried about it a lot. You see it in his writing, in his letters, and so forth. And to leave a written legacy. So he wrote voraciously in the last years of his life, not just Autobiography of a Yogi, but his commentaries on translations of the Bhagavad Gita, his writings about Jesus, all this stuff that his disciples years later would cull together into big voluminous books. But the of course the most important of those was Autobiography of a Yogi, which he got done a few years before his death. But leading up to his death, those last days, and then the final day, where you get the sense that he knew the time was coming, and the circumstances, because he had once said in his love for India that he would die with India on his lips. And that's exactly what happened. It was a celebratory event in Los Angeles for the Indian ambassador and his wife, ambassador to America. This is, just a few years after Indian independence, so it was a very big deal. And Yogananda gave a keynote address and concluded the address by reciting from his poem of his love for India. And then he collapsed at the podium of heart failure and passed. I think you're probably also thinking about um, the preservation of
Yes.
his body, which is, always written about, and how his body was preserved in, unusual state of non-decay,
So that was
um,
the one area I was skeptical about, that part.
and for good reason. For good reason. And there are, to be, objective about this, um, whether, there's people like biologists and coroners have, said, no, that was exaggerated. For one thing, the body was embalmed and that would change things. And then it was, covered and so forth at a certain time. So it really was not that unusual. So if you want to believe that his body was preserved in an unusual way because he was a great yogi, you can find evidence for that, and it might reinforce your feelings about him and the possibilities of, you know, spirit becoming flesh and so forth. Um, on the other hand, if you want to be skeptical about it, there's very good reason to be skeptical and evidence. As far as I'm concerned, I think doesn't his teachings and his accomplishments, isn't that enough? Do you really need something like his body lasted longer, in a undecayed state? No one's going to dig it up and, look for evidence all these decades later. I don't, to me, it doesn't matter whether his body decayed as normal or not. Doesn't
Especially,
add
yeah,
to or subtract from his work and his contribution.
very good point. Especially since one of his teachings is to tell us we are not our bodies, you know?
Exactly. And yeah, but at the same time, people
Yes.
they look for signs.
Yeah. Um, do you have a final message or blessing for those listening, Philip?
Um, I'm more inclined to messages than blessings.
Okay.
Because I'm just an ordinary guy who writes about certain things. Um, yes, I would say with respect to Yogananda, his life story, his personality, his example is one we can all learn from as we make our way through life as spiritual beings having a human experience and um, aspiring to spiritual realization. At the same time, I would say his teachings and the principles and practices that he brought to the world matter more than his personality. And I think he would be the first person to say that.
Thank you so much, Philip. This has been such an enriching and enlightening conversation. I'm so glad for you sharing your time and your insights. And thank you for everyone listening for being here and for exploring these questions with an open heart. I hope everyone enjoyed this as much as I did.